In the stifling darkness of a late August night in the year 410, the eternal city of Rome held its breath as unseen hands quietly swung open the massive Solarian gate. The sound was barely audible at first, a faint metallic groan swallowed by the humid air, yet it carried the weight of 8 centuries of unbroken invincibility. Torchlight flickered against ancient stone walls that had once defied Gauls and Carthaginians alike, and the distant rumble of thousands of feet began to echo through the sleeping streets. No trumpets blared, no battle cries shattered the silence. Instead, a disciplined column of Visigothic warriors under King Alaric slipped inside like shadows, their iron weapons glinting faintly under a moonless sky. The air was thick with the residue of a long siege, unburied corpses rotting in alleyways, the acrid stench of smoke from meager cooking fires, and the low murmur of desperate prayers rising from churches where terrified citizens had sought refuge. For the first time since the days of Brennus in 390 BC, the heart of the Roman world was about to be pierced, not by overwhelming force alone, but by a slow accumulation of fractures that no one inside the walls had truly believed could lead to this. The collapse did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in on the footsteps of men who had once served as Rome's own allies. And by the time the gates yielded, the irreversible rupture had already begun. Centuries earlier, Rome had risen as the unchallenged mistress of the Mediterranean, her legions carving out an empire that stretched from the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa. By the late 4th century, however, that vast dominion had fractured under the weight of its own success and the relentless pressures of a changing world. The empire had been divided between East and West, with the Western court now sheltering in the marshy safety of Ravenna rather than the monumental hills of Rome itself. Economic strains gnawed at the foundations, taxes grew heavier as farmland lay fallow from repeated barbarian incursions, trade routes faltered, and the once mighty legions relied more and more on Germanic recruits whose loyalty was often bought rather than forged in Roman discipline. Pagan temples stood alongside rising Christian basilicas, their marble columns echoing with hymns that spoke of a new order. Yet old gods still whispered in the forums, where senators debated in fading togas. The city itself, though diminished from its imperial peak of perhaps 500,000 souls, retained its grandeur. Aqueducts still flowed with fresh water from distant hills. Public baths steamed with the chatter of merchants and slaves, and the Colosseum hosted games that masked the underlying fragility. But beneath the surface of marble and mosaic, invisible cracks were widening, and the once invincible machinery of Roman power was beginning to seize under the strain of migrations, court intrigues, and an emperor too distant to feel the pulse of his own capital. Life in Rome on the eve of catastrophe unfolded in rhythms that had endured for generations, a daily cadence of survival and routine that belied the gathering storm. Dawn broke over the 7 hills with the clatter of wooden carts hauling produce from nearby farms, their wheels grinding against cobblestones worn smooth by countless footsteps. In the crowded insulae, families rose in cramped apartments stacked like honeycombs, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke as slaves prepared simple meals of porridge and olives. Merchants haggled in the Forum Romanum, their voices rising above the splash of fountains fed by aqueducts that still carried water from the Sabine hills, while in the public baths, citizens scrubbed away the grime of the day amid echoing laughter and the slap of oiled skin on marble. Christian priests led processions through streets lined with statues of forgotten emperors, their chants mingling with the occasional pagan rite performed in secret corners by those who cling to the old ways. Children played in the shadow of the Pantheon, unaware that the empire's frontiers were fraying. Women drew water from public wells, exchanging gossip about distant wars and the latest edicts from Ravenna. Yet even in these ordinary moments, a quiet unease lingered. The price of grain had doubled in recent years, rumors of Gothic hordes circulated like whispers in the wind, and the faces in the crowds included more and more refugees from provinces ravaged by earlier raids. Daily existence continued, as it always had because Rome had always endured, its people convinced that the gods or the one god would never allow the city to fall. The warning signs had been there for decades, subtle at first, like the faint tremors before an earthquake that no one in the capital chose to acknowledge. Far to the north and east, entire peoples were on the move, Goths, Vandals, Alans, pushed by the relentless advance of the Huns from the Asian steppes. their migrations crashing against Rome's borders like waves against a weakening dam. The catastrophic defeat at Adrianople in 378 had already shattered the illusion of Roman military supremacy, leaving thousands of legionaries dead and exposing the vulnerability of the frontiers. In the years that followed, treaties were signed and broken, subsidies paid to barbarian chieftains who grew bolder with each payment, and Roman generals increasingly turned to these same warriors to fill the ranks of depleted armies. Within the empire, internal rot deepened. Corruption siphoned resources meant for defenses. The senatorial class hoarded wealth, while the poor starved, and religious schisms between Orthodox Christians, Arians, and lingering pagans divided loyalties at the very moment unity was needed most. Alaric himself, a Visigoth who had risen through Roman service, embodied the blurred lines. Once a commander of auxiliary troops, he now demanded land, gold, and titles for his people, sensing the weakness in the heart of the West. Yet in Rome, life went on with the stubborn optimism of an ancient power. The Senate debated. The emperor issued proclamations from afar, and the people told themselves that these were merely passing troubles, that the walls built by Augustus would stand forever. But no one understood what was coming next, how these distant pressures would converge on the city's very gates. Tension mounted steadily as Alaric's Visigoths, hardened by years of campaigning and betrayal, turned their eyes squarely toward Rome itself. By late 408, after the execution of the powerful general Stilicho, whose half-Vandal heritage and pragmatic dealings with the Goths had made him a scapegoat for court rivals, the balance of power shifted irreversibly. Alaric, denied the high command in the homeland he sought for his followers, marched south with an army swollen by disaffected Roman troops and Gothic kin. The first siege gripped the city in the winter chill, encircling its 13 gates and severing supply lines from the port of Ostia. Inside, panic spread like wildfire. Grain was rationed first to half, then a third of normal portions, and soon the streets filled with the hollow-eyed stares of the starving. Disease followed hunger, corpses lay unclaimed in the forums, and the stench of decay hung over the Tiber like a shroud. Envoys were dispatched, ransoms negotiated in gold and silver stripped from pagan shrines, including the very statue of Virtus, the embodiment of Roman courage, melted down in a final act of desperation. Alaric withdrew temporarily after extracting tribute, but the damage was done. The myth of impregnability had cracked. A second siege in 409 brought further humiliation, and by the summer of 410, after failed negotiations in which the Emperor Honorius and distant Ravenna refused any meaningful concession, Alaric's patience evaporated. The Visigoths returned, more determined than ever, their campfires visible from the city walls like a ring of judgment. Key decisions in Ravenna and within Rome's own walls sealed the fate that was unfolding with merciless precision. Emperor Honorius, young and isolated in his marsh-bound palace, surrounded himself with courtiers who prioritized palace intrigue over the desperate pleas from the capital. When Alaric demanded not just payment but a formal alliance and territory within the empire, the response was evasion and insult, a fatal miscalculation born of arrogance and fear. In Rome, the Senate, stripped of real authority, yet still clinging to ancient prestige, wavered between appeasement and defiance, ultimately powerless without imperial support. Stilicho's death in 408 had removed the one leader capable of negotiating with the Goths on equal terms, leaving a vacuum filled by lesser men who viewed compromise as weakness. Religious leaders urged prayer and penance, some pagans secretly reviving forbidden rites in hopes the old gods would intervene, while Christian bishops like Innocent I sought diplomatic paths that led nowhere. Pressures mounted from every side, famine gnawing at the populace, fear eroding morale, and the knowledge that the legions once stationed across the empire had been recalled or destroyed, leaving the city defended by little more than its ancient walls and the fading aura of its name. By the third encirclement in August 410, the system that had sustained Rome for a millennium was no longer merely strained. It was on the verge of catastrophic failure, and the decisions made in distant halls and desperate forums had rendered the outcome inevitable. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a thunderous assault, but with a quiet betrayal under cover of night. On August 24th, as the city lay exhausted from months of deprivation, someone, perhaps a desperate slave, a disloyal noble, or simply a gatekeeper broken by hunger, unbarred the Salarian gate. The Visigoths poured through without resistance, their disciplined ranks moving swiftly into the heart of the city that had once commanded the known world. There were no massive breaches in the walls, no heroic last stand at the gates. Instead, the fall came through the slow erosion of will and the opportunistic strike of those who had learned Roman ways too well. Alaric, a Christian king in his own right, issued orders to spare the churches and those sheltering within them, directing his warriors toward the palaces and wealthy homes rather than indiscriminate slaughter. Yet the shock was profound. Cries echoed through the Subura district as doors were forced open, treasures hauled away in carts that creaked under the weight of silver plate and jeweled icons, the air filled with the clash of bronze vessels, the crackle of overturned braziers, and the occasional scream cut short by command. For 3 days the pillage continued, focused and methodical, as the mausoleums of Augustus and Hadrian were rifled, their imperial ashes scattered to the winds in a final desecration of Rome's ancestral glory. The collapse, long prepared in silence, had finally broken through. Human consequences unfolded in the streets and homes with a raw intimacy that no chronicle could fully capture. Families who had clung to routine through the sieges now faced the stark reality of violation. Wealthy senators watching their libraries looted, their daughters taken as hostages or worse, while the poor, already weakened by starvation, huddled in doorways as Gothic warriors claimed what little remained. Yet Alaric's restraint, rooted in his Arian faith, spared many lives. Refugees in the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul emerged unharmed, their presence a testament to the new religion's protective power, even amid barbarian fury. Smoke rose from a handful of public buildings set alight in the chaos, but the great temples and forums largely stood, their marble facades scarred only by the passage of armed men. Tales spread of slaves joining the looters in revenge for years of bondage, of noble women choosing death over dishonor, and of ordinary citizens bartering their last possessions for survival. The Tiber ran red with blood in places, yet the city did not burn to the ground. Instead, it bled its accumulated riches into the hands of the Visigoths, who loaded wagons with gold, silks, and even the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia, as a prize. Fear and despair settled like a heavy fog, breaking the spirit of a people who had believed their world eternal, and in the aftermath, silence fell over districts once alive with commerce and song. Social breakdown accelerated in the days and weeks that followed, as the fragile bonds holding Roman society together unraveled under the weight of trauma and loss. Refugees streamed out of the gates toward safer provinces or the east, carrying stories that would ignite panic across the empire. Those who remained scavenged among the ruins, bartering scraps of food amid a black market born of desperation. Pagan voices rose in accusation, blaming the Christianization of the empire for provoking divine wrath, while Christian leaders countered that the sparing of churches proved God's mercy amid judgment. Old hierarchies fractured. Senators who had once dictated policy now begged for aid, slaves asserted fleeting freedoms in the confusion, and the urban poor, long marginalized, turned to banditry or migration. The stench of unburied dead lingered, disease claimed more victims than the swords had, and the once vibrant forums echoed with the hollow footsteps of survivors picking through debris. What had been a city of laws and order descended into pockets of lawlessness, its social fabric torn not by total annihilation, but by the sudden exposure of its underlying vulnerabilities. The rupture was not merely physical. It was a collective shattering of confidence, a moment when the invisible ties of civilization proved as fragile as the gates that had swung open in the night. The long-term historical impact of that August in 410 rippled outward like cracks across a marble statue, reshaping the trajectory of Western civilization in ways few could have foreseen. News traveled swiftly to the far corners of the empire. In Bethlehem, St. Jerome laid down his pen in grief, his voice breaking as he wrote that the city which had conquered the world had itself been conquered, questioning what safety remained anywhere if Rome could fall. In North Africa, St. Augustine began composing The City of God, a profound defense of Christianity that reframed earthly empires as transient, urging believers to fix their eyes on a heavenly kingdom rather than a crumbling one on the Tiber. The sack accelerated the decline of the Western Roman Empire, already weakened, by demonstrating to every barbarian leader that the heart of Rome was vulnerable. Within decades, further incursions would follow, culminating in the deposition of the last emperor in 476. Trade networks contracted further, urban populations dwindled as people fled to rural estates or the more secure east, and the cultural confidence of classical antiquity gave way to the fragmented world of early medieval Europe. Yet Rome itself endured physically, its monuments scarred but standing, a living witness to the process of transformation rather than outright destruction. The event marked not the end of history, but the beginning of a new era, where power shifted from imperial legions to federated kingdoms, and the Church emerged as the enduring institution bridging antiquity and the Middle Ages. Even as the Visigoths departed southward laden with spoils, carrying Galla Placidia toward an uncertain future, the city they left behind began the slow work of recovery, its people sifting through the ashes of their former glory. Alaric himself would die within months, his dream of a Gothic homeland unfulfilled, yet the precedent he set endured. In the years that followed, Rome's population shrank dramatically, its grand public works fell into disrepair, and the once bustling streets grew quieter, haunted by memories of a time when the world had seemed eternal. The sack became a symbol, etched into the collective memory of Europe, a cautionary tale whispered in chronicles and sermons for centuries to come. Empires do not fall in a single cataclysm, but through a series of quiet erosions, decisions deferred, and warnings ignored until the gates swing open in the dark. Historians would debate its scale, looting over massacre, plunder over pyres, yet its psychological wound cut deeper than any sword. The eternal city had been humbled, its aura of invincibility shattered forever, and in that humbling lay the seed of a transformed world order. What remained in the wake of those 3 days was not ruin, but revelation, a haunting reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are built on foundations that can erode unseen. The forums where Cicero had once spoken now bore the faint scars of hurried footsteps and scattered treasures, silent witnesses to the fragility beneath imperial pomp. Citizens who had walked those streets with the assurance of destiny now moved with the cautious gait of survivors, their daily rituals forever tinged with the knowledge that security is an illusion. The sack of Rome did not end the empire overnight, nor did it erase its cultural legacy. Instead, it exposed the hollowness of its late-era pretensions, forcing a reckoning that echoed through the writings of Jerome and Augustine and into the very soul of medieval Christendom. As the sun rose on the morning after the Visigoths withdrew, casting long shadows over the Palatine Hill, the city stirred once more, but something fundamental had changed. The process of collapse had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. In the quiet hours that followed, one could almost hear the distant footsteps of future ages approaching, empires yet unborn rising from the very soil where Rome had faltered. The reflective weight of that day lingers across the centuries, a spectral presence in the ruins that still stand defiant against time. Rome's fall was never a singular explosion of chaos, but a protracted unraveling, beginning in the subtle missteps of emperors and generals, gathering force through the desperation of sieges, and culminating in the quiet opening of a gate under starless skies. Its human cost, lives disrupted, faiths tested, societies reordered, served as a mirror for every subsequent civilization confronting its own vulnerabilities. The Visigoths, once outsiders demanding inclusion, had become the agents of a transformation they could scarcely comprehend, their restrained plunder preserving enough of the old order to seed the new. In the end, the Eternal City taught the harshest lesson of all: no wall, no legion, no divine favor can forever defy the currents of history when internal decay aligns with external pressure. And as the last wagons rolled away into the Italian countryside, laden with the wealth of ages, the silence that settled over Rome carried a warning for all who would listen, that the collapse, when it comes, begins not with the roar of armies, but with the unnoticed creak of a gate yielding in the night, and by then, it is already too late to close it again.